We had a last-minute technical problem. We lost the internet very briefly, but now we've found our internet and we're back again, and hopefully everything will be fine. So thank you for your patience, and I do apologize. We were here. Unfortunately, the internet very briefly was not. For those of you who I have not met before, good afternoon. My name is Steve, working for Express Publishing, here with our partners in Russia, Prosvещение. And today we're conducting a series of webinars on a number of different subjects. This particular one will be broadly about communication. And then after this, the last seminar of the day will be about developing writing skills, looking more specifically at writing as a form of communication. So there will be a connection between these next two seminars. On a quick note, let me just explain a couple of things technically of a technical nature. As you will have understood, this seminar will be taking place in English, simply because I don't really have a choice. I'm afraid I don't speak Russian, so the seminar will be in English. If, however, you have questions of a technical nature, if anything, for example, to do with sound or image, or if you need some information about where to get your certificates from, then please feel free to comment in the comments section at the side of the screen for my colleague Svetlana, who will be able to deal with that. But those comments, please, should be in Russian. Anything that you would like me to address, please feel free to send a message in English. If for any reason we can't get through all the comments and everything by the end of this webinar, then I will be giving you an email address at which you are very welcome to contact me for any comments or further discussion you would like. So please feel free to use that. I'll give it you towards the end because there are still people joining the conversation and I don't want them to miss the email address. Sometimes, unfortunately, we just run out of time. We don't avoid questions, but sometimes it's just not possible to answer everything. So please feel free to use that address if you'd like to discuss anything further. So I think that is all the technical stuff taken care of, and we shall now get down to business. This seminar is based on an idea that I had that came up in discussion. And there's so many people from so many different areas saying hello. Got Murmansk here, Crimea, Kamchatka, my word. It really is absolutely wonderful that during these webinars we get in touch with so many different areas geographically. It really is actually very exciting. And I'm sorry I can't say hello to every single region, but you are all most welcome, and we are very happy to have people here from all over the place. It's absolutely wonderful. So you're all welcome. The seminar, as I was saying, was based on some ideas I had and some conversations I had with colleagues. One of my general ideas that I like to discuss with colleagues is the fact that sometimes in language education we tend to talk in very broad terms. We talk about communication, for example, in this case, improving communication skills. We talk about increasing learners' motivation or creativity. And for me, what I find is that sometimes these expressions, although we kind of understand what they mean, are not always very helpful because they tend to be umbrella terms. They tend to be terms which cover a number of different aspects. So what I wanted to do in this seminar, and then we'll look at it more specifically in the webinar, I should say, and then we'll look at it more specifically in the last one, is to break things down. I like to see if we can break things down into little entities, because then I believe that we can use these to improve the general skill that we're trying to look at. And I think this will become clearer as we go through. So what I wanted to do, and what I researched and what I looked into, was the idea of communication. We teach English. We tend to follow these days the communicative approach, based on ideas that come to us from things like the Common European Framework of Reference, ideas that come to us from education ministries and methodists, methodologists, and people who do research and write material. So what I wanted to do was to see if we could take communication as a language teaching concept and break it down just a little bit so that it would make it easier for us as teachers to help our learners improve this very important skill. And that's what we're going to be looking at as we go through. Now, talking of the Common European Framework, the framework has something very important to say about the general skill of communication. This is a quote on your screen right now from the Common European Framework regarding a definition, if you like, of communicative competence. Communicative language competence, it tells us, can be regarded as comprising several components: linguistic, social linguistic, and pragmatic. And this is a very important thing to bear in mind, and I have discussed it in seminars around the country on several occasions, that when we're looking at the communicative skill, communicating effectively, we need to not just look at the linguistic aspects of the language. Obviously, and we'll discuss this more a little later on, and obviously ideas connected to vocabulary and good grammar are important. They're not going away. No one's pretending they're not important. But there are additional things, additional aspects that can determine the success or failure of communication. And by communication, I mean written or spoken, whatever form it may happen to take. And those concerns are also social linguistic and pragmatics. Hello again, Victoria. Victoria mentions the word cultural, and I would put those kind of ideas, the cultural concepts of communication, within the social linguistic and pragmatic area. In that, obviously, I have to get the right vocabulary and grammar, but my communication has to obey and follow certain rules dictated either by the culture, the language culture with which I'm communicating. And please remember, language culture doesn't just mean geographical culture. Language culture can be a conversation, for example, among experts. It can be trade journals, that there is a language that is full of jargon and full of shared references that people in the same profession, for example, all understand. And communication within that group is also in many ways a kind of cultural experience. So when we're communicating, we not only have to think about the language, we have to think about the social linguistic and the pragmatic effects. If those two effects, if we don't think about them, if we don't get those right, then our communication may well fail. Quite simply because, no, I agree with you, Victoria, and I will quite happily accept the kind of the social, socio-cultural phrase that you use. It absolutely makes sense. What our colleague in the chat there, Victoria, is saying, and I wholeheartedly agree with her, is that if our communication, for example, accidentally offends somebody, then our communication is likely to fail, or it's certainly not going to get us the response that we desired. A very simple example of this, which ties in grammar and this kind of social linguistic and the cultural elements, is one that you all know. If, for example, in the UK, you go into a shop and the shopkeeper greets you politely, I hope, and then says, "Good morning, what would you like?" And as a customer, if you reply, "I want a newspaper," you know as language teachers that I have broken a rule there. Now, in terms of the linguistic aspects, it's a perfectly good sentence. I want a newspaper fulfills all the rules of grammar that we need. It's a perfectly good sentence. It communicates information. There is no doubt about the other person would understand what you want. But at the same time, we have handled very badly the kind of the social linguistics and the cultural aspects of that communication, because as you know, in the UK, it's considered rude to say, "I want." Now, I don't know why that is, I'll be honest with you. I just know that it is. And the native speaking English person's response to that would be very negative. So when we have to communicate effectively to get the response that we want, we have to bear in mind a whole bunch of different things. And this is what we're going to be looking at now as we go through the presentation. Now, let me go through. This is the structure I'll be following. What's rude as well? Yeah, there are so many things that sound rude. in language, and it is a minefield. And interestingly, non-native to non-native don't particularly worry about that, but when we speak to native speakers, it becomes an issue. So, not to get distracted, because I do get distracted because I enjoy talking about language, so forgive me if I pick up on some of the comments. We're going to be following this, what I find to be a very helpful kind of breakdown of what communication is about. You'll find the quotation underneath as to where I found it, to give credit where credit is due. This is not my invention, but what I wanted to do was to look at it very much from an English language teaching, English as a foreign language teaching perspective, and to think about what that might mean, and also to think about communication in the 21st century and how that also affects this whole idea of communication and how to improve it. So as we go through, we'll be taking each of these sections and just thinking a little bit about how we might help our learners at each stage perform slightly better, what we're going to ask them to think about, and the kind of advice that we can give them, and the kinds of things that they should be looking at. Before I go any further, on a kind of advertising note, I'll be drawing examples from a number of different sources, Express Publishing and Prosvещение. We do take this idea of communication very seriously. You will find it in all the material. We also have books on writing practice, successful writing, for example. The writing sections and the speaking sections in all our books take these ideas very much to heart. So you'll see some examples. I wanted to mention that now. I'm not going to refer back to books again as we go through. I shall simply show you some examples of the things that we're talking about. So I'm sorry if you're having problems there with the sound. As far as I know, from our side, everything seems to be working very well. It may be, I'm afraid, an interconnection issue, an internet connection issue. And the microphone is very close to me, so I don't know what I can do about that right now. My apologies. I hope maybe if you go back onto the internet, maybe if you close your connection and go back, sometimes the connection gets better. 21st century communication problems. Let us start, and if anyone misses anything because of technical issues or didn't quite hear anything, this again is something that we can discuss by email at a later date with the greatest of pleasure. Let us start at the beginning. The breakdown of communication, it breaks down into source, message, encoding, channel, decoding, receiver, and feedback. These are all elements that can be considered separately, but they are all elements which, when put together, can help us communicate effectively. So let us start at the beginning. So this is the source, the first part of our breakdown of communication skills. And this, in a way, seems very simple and very straightforward, but I would argue that it's not always the case. The source is defined as the person or the thing, in our case a person, although technically speaking it could be artificial intelligence as well, it could be computer generated, but we will stick with human beings because that's who I'm concerned about right now. The source, the person, in this case, sharing the information. Why do they want to communicate? And they must have channels open to them. Now, the last one about having channels open to them doesn't really need discussing. Obviously, if you wish to communicate, there must be a means by which you can transmit your message to somebody else, either in person or using any number of different media. So we're not going to discuss that too much because that's quite explanatory. It's just part of the theory. But the first 2 points are very interesting and bear discussion. And in fact, in the last seminar of the afternoon, as far as improving writing skills, we will be looking at these again in quite a lot more detail. But let's think about the first one. Who is sharing the information? Now, at first sight, of course, that seems very obvious. If I want to communicate, I'm trying to share the information. Or if your students are doing a communication activity in the classroom, written or spoken, they are the ones trying to communicate. But I would argue that if we're going to be successful, we have to think about that just a little more carefully. Because in life, who I am changes. I do not always communicate as I communicate, in my case, as Steve, but my role in any particular communication situation is likely to change. Very simply put, all of us, those of us working as teachers, we communicate as teacher, we communicate as parent, some of us, we communicate as partner, we communicate as customer, we communicate in various roles in our lives. And our learners need to know how to change their communication depending on who they are. It's a very important part that sometimes learners forget. And what will then happen is that if they don't get that right, if they don't understand what it means to be whoever they're supposed to be, their choice of communication, the way they communicate, and the ultimate effect of their communication may well break down. So it's very important whenever our learners are preparing for some kind of communicative activity that we establish within that communicative activity who they are. And I'll show you some examples in the next slide. And then we have why do they want to communicate? Now, 9 times out of 10 in the classroom, why we want to communicate is because teacher says we have to communicate. But if we're looking at developing our communication skills, then it's very important that learners understand why. And again, this is something that can sometimes be labeled too easily, and we use labels that ultimately don't mean anything. So for example, when we do a letter of complaint, so we say to our learners, you know, why do you want to communicate? They go to complain. But really that's not at the heart of the communication. A letter of complaint or verbal communication or using the internet or whatever will usually have another driving force behind it. So for example, why am I communicating? Because I want some kind of compensation. I want my money back, or I want an alternative or something like this. So in answer to the question, why do I want to communicate? The answer is to get compensation, to get whatever it may happen to be. Sometimes I write a letter of complaint not really expecting anything, but just because I'm very angry and I just need to get it off my chest. I want to express myself, I want to express that so that they know that I was angry. And in a way, I suppose that's kind of a pointless communication. But the truth of the matter is that sometimes things drive us absolutely mad, and we want to share it with someone else so that we can get closure on that, and you know, we can kind of, our minds can return to a peaceful state. Let the steam off, absolutely. So sometimes we have the same type of communication, complaining, but 2 very different aims which should have very different results. So when we're getting our learners to communicate in a speaking activity or a writing activity, please do establish, firstly, what is your role in this communication, and B, what are you truly trying to achieve? If we get that sorted out right at the beginning, then a lot of things start to fall in place. And that's what we'll talk about as we go through. I should have an example. I keep pressing the wrong button. There we go. I keep thinking it's PowerPoint. It's not. That's okay. So, for example, and I've taken these, as I said, from a number of different sources. In this first activity at the top of the screen, it's just a simple communication activity, just a discussion. But it says, imagine you were a reporter. Now, if you're a reporter at some kind of catastrophe, it's about a natural catastrophe. As a reporter, you're not going to be talking about the way you feel. A reporter's job is to report the events as they see them. So if you are, the aim of their conversation, their speech, is to inform, to present the events. So, you know, if you're a reporter who's witnessed a natural disaster, standing there and saying, I was absolutely terrified, I saw my life flashing before my eyes, I was worried I'd never get home to my family again. All of those things may be perfectly true and perfectly human responses. But if I'm a reporter, my job is to report the facts and say, this whole thing started at this time in the morning. Our first indication something were wrong with this. Then this is the event that happened. Now in the aftermath of the event, these are the steps that are now being taken. So we have to be very, very careful that we know who we are, so that we present the events, someone mentioned a very important word, we present the events as a reporter objectively and with as little emotional content as humanly possible. If you're calling a friend to ask them, they were involved in an area that was flooded or an earthquake, if you're calling a friend, a completely different response is needed there. And the same reporter, if they were on the phone to their wife, their family, their husband, the same reporter would speak in a completely different way if they were speaking to one of their loved ones about exactly the same event. This is why it's important to keep us focused, to keep us using the correct language to provide the communication that's required. In the second example, just to mention it because it's there, it says, this is one of our presentation skills sections. It says, imagine you're a school counselor, give a presentation about bullying. Now, a school counselor's role is to help students, to support them psychologically, help students handle problems, so on and so forth. So in the case of the counselor is not going to talk about, usually, their experience of being bullied, how they felt. What they're going to do is to provide, hopefully, some objective information about why people bully, some advice about how to deal with it, maybe some psychological support and some guidance. If you are being bullied, what should you do? How should you behave? So there should be an informative element to that communication. Again, not just a personal experience, not just relating how they feel about it. So you can see already, I hope, that it's very, very important that we establish who we are in the dynamic of the communication, so that we select the information and the way we present the information that we've selected. In the first case, more dispassionately. In the second case, okay, there may be a little bit of human emotion, but again, the information should be helpful, it should be a little objective and designed in a way that students can relate to it. The council using it, indeed. So we've established who we are and why we want to communicate. Now we can start thinking about the message itself. We've established our ground rules, our basic principles. Now we're going on to think of the content more specifically, the information I want to communicate. And I think we've covered that already, and how that stems from who I am and why I want to communicate. The second point on the screen in front of us is also very, very important. That the message and the format must be congruent. Simple examples of this in terms of spoken communication. It's a cliche, but it's very helpful. If we go to a job interview and I have done all the right things, I've learned a little bit about the company I'm going for the interview with, I've learned what they do, I've learned what they're looking for, I've practiced, some things to say about myself. So in terms of the message content, to sell myself, to show the company I would be a good employee, I've done my homework and that's okay. But if I go in my scruffy jeans, unwashed, unshaven, maybe a bit smelly, my message and the format I'm presenting are no longer congruent. So I'm sending out mixed messages. And this is very, very important in communication. That everything has to be, it's a term that's often used in politics, everything has to be on message. This is why people making serious presentations, for example, at conferences, like I do frequently, or even politicians, when they appear to make statements, they try to make sure that the way they're dressed and the surroundings they're in reflect the content of what they're talking about. This is also important, for example, when we think about writing, and this is why we have conversations with students about things like formal and informal writing, and also about the format of the way we write. And we will come back to this again in a few minutes, because it's very important that our learners learn it's not just what you say, it's the way that you say it, the format in which you say it. So, for example, writing a business email, and a serious business email, and filling it with emoticons and smiley faces and things like that. It's just not appropriate. What you're trying to say says one thing, the way it looks says another. And please remember, on the final point on this one, that as human beings, we are very sensitive to messages that are very, very fine and very subtle. Expressions on the face that last for microseconds, they're called micro-expressions. We're very sensitive to eye contact. We're very sensitive to the way people stand when they're talking to us, to the tone of voice. We pick up clues constantly, and many of you will know it is these clues from conversation, from communication, that actually will determine the message the other person receives. And if the two are not the same, if what I'm saying and all the other information do not match, the person is less likely to believe what is said and more likely to believe all the other information. It still matters how we look. It still matters how we stand. It still matters how the eye contact. And if we're writing communication, yes, it still matters that the format of that communication is appropriate for the communicative situation in which I find myself. Very, very important indeed. And sometimes our learners think we're belaboring it, and in fact, it is very important. Part of that, and interestingly enough, I think for those of you especially maybe working in vocational language learning, in ESP, as you will know, we have a series called Career Paths we use for ESP. This is on the screen, is taken from on screen, but we do the same thing in Career Paths. This use of correct jargon, correct vocabulary, correct terminology. If you stood up as teachers in a conference and you used terminology, I just did it there. It's been a long day. If you used your terminology incorrectly in front of your colleagues, what would happen is you would end up kind of being laughed at or making a fool of yourself. If you make a fool of yourself, your message becomes destroyed, even though your message may be perfectly accurate and perfectly valid. So again, it's not just a question of body language, etc. It's also a question of the way we speak, the words that we use, the accuracy of the language that we use also plays a role in making sure that those two messages are congruent. I want to be professional, I have to sound professional, for example. It's my full session. Thank you very much, Natalia, for your understanding, and I apologize for my teeth rebelling just at that moment. I try very hard. You've been very kind and very understanding. So now I have decided a number of things, and you can see, I hope, that there's a logical sequence to what we're talking about. We've decided in general terms where we want to go. We've thought more specifically about our message, again, spoken or written. We've thought about the format that will be appropriate to that, the language that will convey the correct message. Now we have to start putting it all together. And very importantly, at this stage, we have to start really making sure that I know what I want to communicate. How can I ensure that the other person can understand it? It's one thing for me to know. Obviously, the recipient has to understand as well. And one of the things we have to do there is to be aware of what could cause a communication breakdown. And there are any number of ways that can happen, and we've already touched on some of them. So, for example, the wrong body language, the wrong dress code, the wrong format in my writing could do that. But also, if we think about terminology, if, for example, I am an expert in a certain field, and I'm writing to a group of people or a person who may not have my expertise in a particular field, I probably am not going to use tons and tons of terminology of specific to my profession, terminology specific to my profession. I will have to explain and either avoid, or if I do use terminology, give a little explanation to make sure that the person who receives that communication will be able to understand it, to exemplify it. Sometimes especially when I'm speaking to students, I use a lot of examples and stories to try and make clear what it is that we're talking about. So always, 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 once I've decided what I'm doing, I have to kind of, in a way, put myself inside the head of the recipient of the communication and say, okay, How are they going to look at this? How are they going to understand it? And that's a very important step that learners need to make. Other things that can affect communication, of course, are things like if it's written communication or even if it's spoken, bad use, wrong use of language, confusing grammar, ambiguity, when I'm writing sentences, etc. All of these things I need to think about, which is why one of the things we need to train our learners to do is to check. You'd be surprised how many times, even in my own email writing, I'm not leaving myself out of this. I'm as guilty as everybody else. But what I do always before I send an email is read it through a couple of times very quickly to catch if I've made spelling mistakes. But more important than that, if the information flow is logical and if my sentences are clear and direct and it would be immediately understandable from the recipient what I'm trying to say. A lot of the time, students don't do this. They always need to look at it again. I did this as an experiment once. We were doing interview practice for an exam, and I recorded the students. What I didn't do was play it back to them right there and then. I know, just a small recorder. These days you can do it on your mobile phone. In those days, I had to use a small cassette recorder, a small digital recorder, not cassette, sorry. Cassettes are even older. I used a small digital recorder to record my students, just a couple of them. And then a week later, I played it back. And what I found was that they spotted so many slips of the tongue, errors. At one point, the girl, one of the students, she said, "Oh my God, did I really say that?" So it is quite possible that our students will pick up on, not just, and again, remember please, I'm not just talking about errors for grammar's sake, I'm talking about errors that will lead to bad communication. People pick up on this. Even I, when I write my own emails, I read it twice and I'll still find that punctuation could be improved or the phrasing could be worked better. There's always an improvement you can make, let's be fair. So learners should be encouraged, please, certainly when they do writing, to read it through. You can see on the screen, these days, one of the things we do these days, I think it's a great idea, is to provide these checklists that learners go through before, for example, handing in composition. And we make it very clear, very specific. Look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this, to direct them in that way. Also, if you're doing a speaking activity, it's not a bad idea, not after every speaking activity, but after situational speaking activities, for example, to say to your learners, okay, how did that go? And if you think there were problems, maybe you could ask one of the partners to say, okay, you were the recipient of this communication. Did you truly understand? What was the problem? So that very politely and constructively, very importantly, constructively, we get our learners to focus on times in a speaking activity when they weren't really sure what was being said. Now that might be a logical progression, it might be linguistic, it might be the grammar or the vocabulary, it might even be something to do with the volume of the person's voice or that they weren't making the eye contact, whatever it was. Feedback. We'll come back to that at the end of this. But always, 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 always allow that little bit of time for checking, encourage it, and also discussing things like speaking activities as well. Very, very important indeed. There we go. To our next word, and this is where the 21st century thing comes in. These days, our learners have a massive number of channels available to them to communicate. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that some of them are bad and should be avoided and these are the better ones, because the truth of the matter is all of them are appropriate for various things. When I was learning French at school many, many years ago, if I wished to communicate in French, I would be pretty much limited to either A, speaking directly to someone from France or who spoke French, B, maybe a phone conversation, although that was unlikely that I would speak French on the phone because I didn't know anyone who spoke French, or writing either a letter to an imaginary French person or some writing in French for some reason. These days, our learners have many, many, many more communication channels open to them. Let's have a look at some that I thought of. This is not an exhaustive list. I'm sure there are ones that I've forgotten, but here I just wanted to give an idea of the world in which our learners live. So you've got email going on there, what we call snail mail these days, the kind of official letters in envelopes. You obviously got things like Twitter, I think that's hidden in the top corner, WhatsApp, Viber, Instagram, face-to-face meetings, use of phone, social media, or things like Skype. Now, please don't get me wrong, none of these are good or bad, but some of them are more appropriate for certain types of communication than others. Now, the example that comes when I was reading the research on which this is based, one of the examples they gave was that if you were going to propose marriage to somebody, it probably wouldn't be a good idea to do it via WhatsApp. It would not seem particularly appropriate to ask for such a serious commitment and to make such a romantic statement via WhatsApp. Usually, if we're asking someone, if there's a wedding proposal in the air, it's probably better done in face-to-face environment. Skype is a great aid to communication. It's great for me because I don't live in the same country as my family. We use Skype. We use Skype for business meetings sometimes if we need to speak to our colleagues quickly to explain something. But the truth of the matter is that sometimes business is best done face-to-face. You get a better feel for the way things are going on. You pick up on the different clues a lot easier. So even though these days one could communicate entirely by Skype, sometimes it's much better to actually sit down with the person opposite you at the table. If you're, just another quick example, if you're sending legal documents, a court case or something like that, it should be sent in written form on paper that someone can sign for. Because if you send it by email, they can just deny they ever received it. Whereas if it's sent in an envelope and has to be signed for, there is proof of receipt. And also, it should be filed away, etc. So there are a whole bunch of different channels our learners have available. What they have to do is decide which the best channel is for what they wish to communicate, and then how to communicate it effectively. Another example is, for example, with WhatsApp, that if you're going to use WhatsApp, it's not usually a good idea to write massive long texts. With WhatsApp, we tend to write in short sentences, we use abbreviations, we certainly use emoticons, and that's all appropriate. It's perfectly okay. So the question is not good or bad, the question is which is most appropriate to provide the information, again, to achieve the aim that I want to achieve. So discuss all these with your learners. It's absolutely fine. Many companies these days have a social media presence. So for example, your learners may at some point in the future be responsible for updating the company's Facebook page and things like this. And they would have to learn there how that is done effectively, what's appropriate to put up there, how that works. It is a difficult world into which they move, and what they really do need is lots and lots of practice and lots of examples, and to really think about what they're trying to achieve in that communication. So, a few more minutes, coming towards the end of this cycle now. At the other end of our communication is a recipient. And sometimes in communication, we are not the initiator, we're not the person sending out the communication, we are the person receiving the communication. And that's an important part of communication as well, with the listener as well as being the speaker. One of the things our learners have to do is they have to learn what to do as the recipient of communication if they find that that communication breaks down. So for example, if you're having a conversation with somebody face-to-face or maybe by phone, learning to ask for clarification or learning to repeat it back. Now, this is a little personal secret, but my best friend is from Albania, and we speak Greek together. His Greek is not particularly intelligible. He has a habit of speaking out of one side of his mouth. And over the years, we've been friends for over 20 years, I've learned to deal with him when I can see him face to face. I understand what he's talking about. On the phone, it's not always easy. So when we're on the phone, if we're arranging to go somewhere or do something, hang out as friends do, I always repeat what I think we've arranged. So I will go, okay, so we're meeting at this time at this place to do this, right? And I do that because sometimes I haven't completely understood if that's what he said. And over the years, he's just got used to me doing that, and it's much better to do that than go to the wrong place at the wrong time and do the wrong thing. So when we are in a communication system and we are the recipient, we have to be very careful that we're listening. And if we come across things, for example, when we're listening that don't seem to make logical sense, ask for clarification, politely and non-aggressively. At certain points in the conversation, it's good to summarize, especially if it's a very important conversation. So you can say, so what we're saying is this, and making sure that everybody's on the same page, that we've all got the same information and we're sharing it. If it's written conversation, then of course we may have to write back and ask to clarify a couple of points. Or if it's a linguistic thing, maybe it's as simple as going to the dictionary if we don't understand a word or a phrase. But these are all strategies, and they're all an important part of conversation and all an important part of communication in general. So please, again, think about this with your learners, depending on the communication activity that you're doing. Looking at synonyms, giving them the ability to, at the bottom there, to summarize, giving them choices of phrase that they can use, getting them to understand general tone. If you have a look at the number 2 box there, getting them to understand subtleties. What are these expressions usually used for? Agreeing or disagreeing? Are they positive or negative? So that learners can start to understand the tone of the conversation if it's speech, because that way they will be able to contextualize the information better. If they know it's a positive conversation, what's said is likely to be positive, and the reverse is true if it's not. If it's written, it's a little bit easier sometimes, because written things we can study a little bit, we can take a little more time over. But always, 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 we have to ask ourselves, does this make sense? If yes, good. If not, clarify in one way or the other. Coming back and coming to the end, we've got a couple more left. Who is the receiver? What we have to do is also, again, project ourselves into the mind of the receiver and think about not just what might break communication down, but how they will react to my communication if they understand it. What is the impression I'm trying to create on them? What is the response that I want? How might they decode it, and be prepared for that? Because sometimes, okay, you know that they're going to be angry. Sometimes you know they might be upset. Sometimes you know they're going to disagree with you. That's okay, but that should be in your mind before you send it. It shouldn't be a surprise if you send someone an email rejecting a proposition, maybe in business, and then you get back some kind of objection or some kind of response that shows that they're upset. We really need to plan things through very, very carefully to make sure that we get a response that we expect, and usually the response that we would like to have. They need to put themselves in the position of the receiver, knowing the full context, and ask themselves how they're likely to respond and prepare accordingly. And sometimes, of course, that means that you can preempt and you can say, I know you're going to be upset by this. I know you're going to find this irritating. And by doing that, you can either deflate the situation or deal with things before they become worse. But always, always, always put yourself in the mind of the person receiving it and ask yourself how they are going to feel. Change your language accordingly. How do you speak to people in different situations to get the response you want? If you write to a colleague, they're going to respond differently than if you write to the boss. Or if you write to a child, you have to express yourself differently and explain things in a different way. Always, always, always put yourself in that position. And finally, feedback. We already touched on this idea. I mentioned this idea of checklists, etc. Always, always, always bear in mind the feedback. So if you're having a conversation, learners should be trained to watch the other person. They should be trained to see if the person's face is saying, I understand, or if the other person's face is like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And if they get that feedback, what do? The feedback must be formative. If the person doesn't understand, how can I make that happen? If you get, for example, a response to an email that indicates that they haven't really understood what you said in the first place, how do you fix that communication without being insulting? So instead of saying, you don't understand what I'm talking about, you would write and say something like, I'm terribly sorry, I don't think I explained myself very clearly. You would couch things and you'd phrase things in a way to fix the communication without necessarily being insulting to the other person. So what we've looked at here is that communication is a skill that can be broken down into various parts. I gave you these parts because I found it to be very helpful to focus on different elements that have a logical progression that hopefully will enable our learners to communicate more effectively, but certainly more consciously, more directly, both in spoken and written language. So I'm going to draw that to a close. Do we have any questions? The diagram, okay, yeah, let me go back to the diagram. Someone asked to see it again. Let me put that up while I'm making my closing statements. Come back. There it is. It's from the Elements of Communication, a theoretical approach. It's based on previous research as well. You have the web reference there. Let me also give you my email to finish off with, as promised, for those of you that don't yet have it. As I've explained before, I do have a work email, but to be honest with you, it's a very long thing to type out, and I make lots of typos. So I should give you that one, which is a lot easier. Any comments, any questions arising from this, please feel free to drop me a line. In the next session, in about 15 minutes or so, I hope the internet doesn't break down, we'll be looking at writing as a skill for exams and for communication purposes. And if you can stay with us, that would be great. If you cannot stay with us, that's also great. And whatever you do for the rest of your day, wherever you are, I hope it goes smoothly and happily for you. So thank you very much indeed from me for now, and I'll see you a little later on.